The letter was taped to my front door like a scarlet letter, fluttering in the breeze like it knew it had no business being there. Notice of violation. It read in bold red letters. The offense? Unapproved construction of front porch. Must be removed within 15 days. Subject to daily fines. I stared at it, stunned. My porch? The same porch that had been there when I bought the house 3 years ago? The same porch that showed up in the original listing photos? Yeah, that porch. I live in a quiet neighborhood in northern Georgia, the kind with tall oaks, wraparound porches, and neighbors who wave, but never talk. When I bought the house, it was a little run down, but the bones were solid. I put in the sweat equity weekends spent sanding, painting, hammering, sweating through old clothes with a beer nearby. I didn't touch the porch, though. Didn't have to. It was classic Southern charm, white railing, brick steps, nothing extravagant. But apparently it offended someone. That someone was Karren Kettlewood, the president of our HOA. Mid-50s, sharp bob haircut, pearls even when walking her poodle. She lived 2 streets over, in a house that looked like it was maintained by a team of underpaid but terrified landscapers. I caught her in action that afternoon, arms crossed in her driveway, glaring at my house like it had just flipped her off. "Karren," I called, walking up the sidewalk with the violation notice in hand. "You got a minute?" She turned slowly, lips tight. "Marcus Reddin. I assume you received the notice." "Oh, I got it. Just wondering what part of my porch exactly you think I built." She tilted her head like a bird eyeing a worm. "There is no record of an approved architectural request for that structure. It violates HOA aesthetic guidelines." I blinked. It was on the house when I bought it. There are photos, county records, home inspection reports. You want those? She didn't flinch. Regardless, no record was filed with the HOA. That makes it unapproved. You can appeal it at the next board meeting if you'd like to waste your time. And with that, she turned and walked back into her 2-story palace of beige conformity. Now, most people would have ranted, maybe fumed on social media, then eventually given in or ripped the thing down. But I've got a background in municipal planning and a long fuse with a stick of dynamite at the end. I started digging. First, I requested the HOA's architectural records. Took them a week to respond, and when they did, the files were a joke. Sloppily kept PDFs, missing dozens of entries. My porch wasn't in there, but neither were half the other upgrades I saw around the neighborhood. Karren's fancy white trellis with the climbing roses? Not listed. Her backyard gazebo? Also missing. Second, I pulled the deed history and zoning permits for my house. My porch was built in the early 90s, fully permitted and approved by the county long before the HOA was even formed in 2004. So, I showed up at the next board meeting, held in the clubhouse that smelled faintly of mildew and entitlement. Karren sat at the head of the long table like she was presiding over a war tribunal. A few other board members, mostly retirees who barely looked up from their papers, sat beside her. I stood in front of them and laid out the evidence. County permits, photos from the original listing, a notarized statement from the previous owner confirming the porch predates the HOA. Karren didn't even blink. Regardless of county records, all exterior modifications require HOA approval. Rules are rules, Mr. Reddin. I kept my smile tight. So, what you're saying is, even if something is older than the HOA, you can find a homeowner for it. If it wasn't approved formally, then yes. Even if the HOA didn't exist when it was built? She leaned forward. You're welcome to appeal. But until then, the fines will accrue daily. I nodded. Good to know. That night, I filed a lawsuit in small claims court. Violation of property rights. Abuse of authority. Malicious enforcement of non-existent regulations. I also filed a complaint with the county zoning board and a freedom of information request for all HOA board financial records and voting history. Because something stank, and I had a hunch it wasn't just Karren's perfume. 2 weeks later, the county got back to me. Turns out, the HOA had been issuing fines to multiple homeowners for unauthorized structures, some of which were decades old, like mine. The real kicker? Karren and her cronies had quietly bought up the liens on several foreclosed homes at public auctions, homes they'd fined into oblivion over bogus violations. And guess who approved those fines every time? The HOA board, which just so happened to all live in houses with unapproved additions of their own. I was done playing defense. I hired a lawyer friend, Mason Reeve, who owed me a favor from back in my planning days. We amended the lawsuit to include fraud and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Mason was good, real good. And he loved sticking it to petty tyrants with too much time and too little oversight. By the time our court date rolled around, we had a thick file of evidence, emails between board members, property records, forged violation notices, and even testimony from a former board member who'd resigned in disgust. Karren showed up in a navy suit with a fake smile and a folder of half-baked arguments. She didn't know I had already made calls to the county treasurer's office and was now registered to bid on properties at the next foreclosure auction. When the judge ruled in my favor, Karren's face collapsed. The court ordered the HOA to drop all fines, pay my legal fees, and open their books for a full audit. But I wasn't done. 3 weeks later, I attended the foreclosure auction for a small bundle of HOA-liened properties. Karren's investment strategy had finally backfired hard. Multiple homes were up for auction, including 2 she and her vice president had quietly snatched years back. And guess who swooped in with cash on hand? Yours truly. I bought both houses. Karren didn't even know until the new title paperwork landed in her mailbox. I didn't even have to move in. I just rented them out to a couple of nurses from the local hospital, nice folks, quiet and very eager to live in a Karren-free zone. But the real fun was just beginning. The morning after the auction, I stood on the cracked sidewalk outside one of the houses I now owned. It was a modest brick single-story with a sagging mailbox and a patchy lawn, but the bones were solid. A rusted wind chime clinked lazily in the breeze. I wasn't there to admire the view. I wanted records, receipts, paperwork, anything related to how the HOA had managed these properties. The previous tenants had been evicted 6 months earlier, and the place had sat untouched since. I had the locksmith meet me there, and while he worked the deadbolt, I paced the porch, replaying the judge's ruling in my mind. When the door finally swung open with a low creak, I stepped into a musty hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and the scent of stale air. What caught my eye wasn't the furniture, there was none, but the stack of unopened mail on the floor, fanned out like evidence at a crime scene. I scooped up the envelopes. Most were junk, but a few bore HOA letterheads. I set those aside and moved into what had once been the living room. A folding table stood beneath a dusty ceiling fan, and on it sat a file box. Inside were dozens of manila folders, most labeled with addresses from the neighborhood. One caught my eye, my own. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were copies of property reports, a printed copy of the violation notice Karren had taped to my door, and a handwritten note from one of the board members. Porch looks new, can we hit him with a fine? Ask zoning if they'll back us up. That was dated 2 weeks before I received the notice. I kept flipping. More notes, some with initials in the margins. The tone was casual, like they were picking names out of a hat. In another folder, I found a spreadsheet listing every home that had received fines over the past 5 years. There were columns for violation type, fine amount, and, bizarrely, likelihood to appeal. Some entries were marked push, others drop quietly. My name was marked, resists watch carefully. I stood there for a long moment, folder open in my hands, listening to the creaking of the house settle. These people weren't just sloppy, they were strategic, targeted. They'd been treating the HOA like a personal ATM machine. That afternoon, I met with Mason at his office. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through the files I'd brought. His expression darkened as he scanned the spreadsheet. They were grading residents like credit scores, he said. This isn't just negligence. It's coordinated. I figured. You think this is enough for the DA? It's more than enough for a formal complaint. But we'll need statements. You talked to the other homeowners yet? Not yet. But I've got a plan. I spent the next week walking door to door, not with a clipboard or a petition, just conversation. I chose my timing carefully. Early evenings, when people were home, but not yet worn down by the day. I asked questions, listened, and let them do the talking. A woman on Marigold Lane said she'd been fined for non-compliant garden gnomes. A retired firefighter on Cypress had been forced to repaint his fence 3 times in one summer under threat of escalating fees. One man showed me a letter demanding he remove his satellite dish, even though it was installed with a federal waiver. They were all tired, not just of the fines but of the constant pressure. The feeling that someone was always watching for the next mistake. I stopped planting flowers, said one man, shaking his head. You never knew if they'd decide roses were too vivid that month. By the end of the week, over 20 residents had given me written statements. Mason bundled them with the evidence from the house and filed a formal fraud complaint with the county prosecutor. Meanwhile, the audit ordered by the judge had begun its own slow grind. The board was required to hand over 5 years of financial records to an independent reviewer. I had a contact in the auditor's office, a former colleague from my planning days who tipped me off when things started looking strange. There are checks with double endorsements, she told me quietly over the phone. Board members reimbursing themselves for expenses without receipts. Payments to vendors that don't exist. Anything traceable to Karren? Her name's on half the checks. The fallout began 2 weeks later. Karren didn't show up to the next HOA meeting. Instead, she sent a terse letter of resignation, citing health concerns. The vice president stepped in as interim, but he didn't last long. 2 days after the resignation, his name appeared on the fraud complaint. He stepped down quietly at midnight, hoping no one would notice. But people noticed. The neighborhood that had once been silent and suspicious began to stir. Neighbors who hadn't exchanged more than a nod in years now gathered in driveways, swapping stories. Someone organized a Saturday cookout. Someone else brought a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. I wasn't behind that one, but I didn't stop it either. The county prosecutor launched a formal investigation, and subpoenas were issued. The local paper ran a headline: HOA board under fraud investigation after resident lawsuit. Karren's name was front and center. So was mine. I started getting calls from residents in nearby neighborhoods, people asking how I'd done it, what their rights were, if they could challenge their own boards. I gave them what help I could. One night, as I was loading groceries into my car, a man I didn't recognize approached me in the parking lot. He was in his early 60s, with a windbreaker zipped up to his chin and a cautious look on his face. You Reddin? Yeah. I used to be on the board. Before Karren took over. I quit when she started pulling that garbage. I tried to warn folks, but no one wanted to believe it. You got anything that could help the prosecutor? He nodded. I kept copies. Of everything. He handed me a thumb drive. Back at my house, I plugged it in and opened the files. Emails. Meeting minutes. Internal memos. One email chain caught my eye: Karren discussing how to encourage certain residents to sell by burying them in fines. The recipients? Every board member. I forwarded the drive to Mason. That was the final nail. Indictments followed 2 weeks later. Embezzlement, conspiracy, mail fraud. Karren and 2 other board members were arrested and released pending trial. The rest of the board was dissolved by court order. The neighborhood voted to dismantle the HOA entirely. Not just replace the board, abolish the entire organization. The vote passed with 91% approval. Without the HOA, the community didn't fall into anarchy. If anything, it thrived. People fixed their own fences, painted their houses without permission slips, and planted whatever flowers they damn well pleased. I ended up donating one of the properties I bought to the city for use as a community center. The other I sold to a young couple looking for their first home. I made a modest profit, but more importantly, I made a point. Karren tried to turn a quiet neighborhood into a personal fiefdom. She used intimidation, manipulation, and bureaucracy as weapons. But she forgot one thing. People don't like being pushed forever. Eventually, someone pushes back. And when they do, they don't just stop the abuse. They tear down the whole rotten structure around it, brick by brick. The neighborhood committee that formed after the HOA's collapse met every second Thursday in what used to be the clubhouse, now stripped of its signage and formalities. Folding chairs, donated coffee, no printed agendas. After everything that had happened, people weren't eager to hand their power back to a handful of gatekeepers. They wanted transparency. They wanted to talk to each other, not be spoken for. I arrived a few minutes early and found a seat near the back. The place was filling up fast. Word had spread that the county had finished processing the financial audit, and the investigators were preparing to release their findings. Nancy Callahan, a retired middle school principal with a voice that could cut through a hurricane, stood at the front with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She'd stepped up to organize meetings after the HOA's collapse, not because she wanted control, but because she couldn't abide chaos. She was the kind of person who could get a room of 30 adults to stop talking just by raising an eyebrow. "All right, folks, I know why you're here," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. "We've got a guest tonight. Deputy Auditor Elena Morales is going to walk us through the findings. She's not here to speculate. She's here to report. Let's give her the respect she deserves." Elena stepped forward. Late 30s, sharp eyes, and a calm confidence that immediately quieted the room. She set a thick folder on the table, opened it, and took a breath. "Over the past 3 months, my office has reviewed over 200 financial documents, including expense reports, vendor contracts, and board meeting records submitted under subpoena. We also interviewed 13 current and former residents, 2 former board members, and 1 third-party contractor." She paused to let that sink in. "We found that over the last 5 years, more than $160,000 in HOA funds were misappropriated. Of that, over $90,000 was paid out to companies that do not exist under state registration. Another $30,000 went to reimbursements without any corresponding receipts or justifications. The remaining balance was largely spent on private home improvements for board members' properties, landscaping, exterior painting, even a new roof." A low murmur rippled through the room. "Additionally, we reviewed the process by which fines were issued. We found consistent patterns of targeting residents who had recently refinanced, were behind on dues, or had expressed dissent at previous meetings. In multiple cases, violation notices were issued with forged timestamps or backdated to appear as repeat offenses." A man near the front shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Elena didn't flinch. "All of this constitutes financial misconduct and, in some cases, wire fraud. The findings have been forwarded to the district attorney's office, and criminal charges are being considered." She closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it. "If you're wondering what happens next, civil restitution is the most immediate path. You may be entitled to reimbursement. A separate process for that will begin next month. My office will send out notices with instructions." Nancy stepped back up as Elena nodded and returned to her seat. "We'll keep you posted," Nancy said. "But for now, let's stay focused on rebuilding. There's a lot of work to do." Outside, the spring air was heavy with pollen, but the mood felt lighter than it had in months. People lingered in the parking lot, talking in small groups, comparing notes, making tentative plans to create something grassroots and voluntary instead of another HOA. I was halfway to my truck when Calvin Dorsey caught up to me. He was in his late 40s, owned a local mechanic shop, and had spent years keeping to himself. "You free next week?" he asked. Couple of us are thinking of renting a dumpster and clearing out the junk behind the old maintenance shed. I nodded. Count me in. Appreciate it. Also, I've been meaning to tell you, that thing with the foreclosure? That was legendary. It was necessary. He grinned.
Still.
You made her eat it. That whole board? They thought they were untouchable. The next morning, I got a call from Mason. He was already at the county courthouse, where the first pretrial hearing for the former board members was scheduled. He'd filed a formal motion to have me present as a witness, not just because I'd initiated the lawsuit, but because I'd uncovered key evidence. I arrived just in time to see Karren pacing the hallway outside the courtroom in a navy dress and low heels. She looked smaller without her swagger. She didn't meet my eyes. Inside, the courtroom was sterile and bright, with stiff wooden benches and a judge who looked like she had no patience for nonsense. The defense attorney tried to argue that Karren and the others had merely mismanaged funds without criminal intent, but when the prosecutor began reading aloud from emailed transcripts, ones where board members casually discussed how to pressure specific homeowners into defaulting, the mood shifted. The judge ordered the trial to proceed. No plea deal. No dismissal. Outside, Mason clapped me on the shoulder. That was good. Judges don't usually react that way unless they've already seen something ugly in the paperwork. I'm not getting a medal for this, am I?
No.
But you're going to see justice played out in slow motion, which is almost as satisfying. He wasn't wrong. Over the next few weeks, as the neighborhood settled into its new normal, I kept busy. I helped Calvin and a few others haul scrap metal and torn tarps out from behind the shed. I met with a group of residents who wanted to create a shared tool library, something to replace the old system of permits and penalties with mutual help. One afternoon, while installing new shelves in the community center, I found a cardboard box tucked behind an old filing cabinet. Inside were dozens of unsigned violation letters, still in envelopes, each one addressed by hand, but never mailed. Some were addressed to people who no longer lived in the neighborhood. Others were duplicates of letters already issued. But a few were blank, with only the names filled in. No offenses listed. No dates. Just names and a space where a violation could later be invented. I handed the box to Mason, who added it to the growing archive of evidence. 2 months later, Karren and the others were indicted by a grand jury. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power related to a civil organization. The trial was set for early fall. In the meantime, the neighborhood transformed. The fences once painted under duress became canvases for murals. Kids biked through streets that no longer had speed trap signs posted by HOA decree. Residents planted vegetables in their front yards without fear of being cited for non-ornamental flora. And I stayed out of the spotlight. I didn't want to become the next de facto leader. I just wanted to live in a place where people didn't have to look over their shoulders every time they planted a hydrangea or painted their shutters blue. One evening, I sat on my porch, yes, the same porch that started it all, and watched the sun dip behind the oaks. A moving truck pulled up across the street, and a young couple stepped out. They looked tired but hopeful. The kind of hopeful that only comes with a clean slate. I waved. They waved back. A few minutes later, they crossed the street. You Marcus? The woman asked. Depends who's asking.
I'm Ellie.
This is my husband, James. Heard you're the reason this place doesn't have an HOA anymore. James nodded. We almost didn't buy here because of that. But then we read the article. You're kind of famous. Locally, maybe. But I prefer quiet. Ellie glanced around. It feels different here. In a good way. It is, I said. It will be, if folks keep looking out for each other. They thanked me and headed back across the street. As the porch light flicked on, I leaned back and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood laughter from a backyard, a screen door creaking open, a dog barking in the distance. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was free. And that made all the difference. The trial opened on the first Monday of October, just as the leaves began to copper and curl. The courthouse was packed neighbors, reporters, even a few curious faces from out of town who'd followed the case online. A handful of folding chairs had to be brought in to accommodate the overflow. The energy in the room felt like the first seconds before a thunderstorm. Tight, electric, waiting. I sat 3 rows back on the left, behind the prosecutor's table. Mason was one of the few attorneys not in a suit. He'd opted for a tan jacket and a dark tie that somehow made him look more dangerous than polished. He didn't need to impress anyone anymore. Everyone in that room already knew what he and I had uncovered. Karren sat at the defense table, her posture rigid but her eyes dull, like someone who had run out of backup plans. Her co-defendants, 2 former board members, one of whom had once bragged about keeping the riffraff out at a neighborhood barbecue, looked equally drained. Their attorney, a wiry man with a voice like sandpaper, kept flipping through documents as if a miracle might appear if he turned the pages fast enough. The prosecution opened with a timeline. 5 years of rule twisting, selective fines, and backdoor property grabs. They laid it all out in methodical detail. No dramatic flourishes, just facts, dates, signatures, and patterns of abuse so unmistakable even the jurors began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When it was my turn to testify, the courtroom was silent. No coughs, no chairs squeaking, just the rustle of pages as the prosecutor guided me through the questions. We understand you were the first to challenge the violation notice. What led you to suspect something deeper was going on? I didn't suspect at first, I said. I just knew the porch hadn't been touched in decades. But when they refused to acknowledge county records, I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. And control for profit. The defense tried to rattle me on cross-examination. They pointed out that I bought the foreclosed homes, insinuating I'd had a financial motive all along. Was your intention to discredit the HOA so you could profit off its collapse? The defense attorney asked. No, I said calmly. My intention was to stop them from cheating people out of their homes. Buying those properties was legal. What they were doing wasn't. But you benefited personally, did you not? I benefited the way anyone does when fraud gets exposed by not being its next victim. The prosecutor called more witnesses, residents who'd been fined into submission, others who had moved away rather than fight. One man, a retired postal worker, broke down as he described losing the home he'd lived in for over 30 years. His only infraction? A shade of gray on his shutters that the board claimed didn't meet community aesthetic guidelines. The defense didn't call many witnesses. Most of their strategy relied on casting doubt, not offering explanations. It didn't work. The evidence was too clean, too complete. Paper trails don't lie, and neither did the recorded HOA meetings Mason had managed to subpoena, some of which included offhand remarks about targeting the low-hanging fruit. By the 3rd day of the trial, it was clear where the wind was blowing. After closing arguments, the jury took less than 4 hours to deliberate. The verdict came down just before sunset. Guilty on all counts. Restitution was ordered, along with community service and a full ban from serving on any residential board within the county. The judge didn't mince words during sentencing. You used your positions not to uplift a neighborhood, but to siphon from it. You treated homeowners as obstacles to be managed rather than citizens to be respected. That ends today. When we stepped out of the courthouse, a spontaneous applause broke out. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shook hands, laughed, and even hugged. Not everyone had been directly targeted, but everyone had lived under the same quiet pressure. For the first time, it was gone. That night, I found myself back on the porch, watching as a few kids rode their bikes in lazy circles down the street. An older couple walked their dog past my mailbox and waved without hesitation. The tension that had once hung in the air like humidity had vanished. Nancy stopped by with a 6-pack and 2 battered folding chairs. You think it's over? She asked, cracking open a bottle and handing it to me. Legally? Mostly. But rebuilding trust takes longer than tearing it down. She sipped and looked out at the street. A few of us were talking. No more boards. No more titles. But we want to set up something informal, just neighbors helping neighbors. Have folks rotate responsibilities. Keep it light, honest. That's the right direction. You coming to the next meeting? If there's pie. She laughed. There's always pie. Weeks passed. The former clubhouse had been converted into a lending library and tool exchange. The maintenance shed now housed lawn equipment donated by residents available to borrow, no forms required. Someone organized a mural project on the old HOA billboard, now painted over with a vibrant scene of kids playing under a tree that looked suspiciously like the one in front of my house. I kept to my routine. Fixed up the porch railing where the paint had chipped. Helped Ellie and James install a rain barrel system in their backyard. Mason visited now and then with updates on other neighborhoods trying to challenge their own HOAs. He said our case had become a blueprint. One afternoon, I got a letter from the state attorney general's office. They were launching a task force to investigate residential governance abuse, and they wanted me to serve as a civilian consultant. I read it twice before setting it down. I didn't need a title. I'd already made my point. Instead, I wrote back with a list of recommendations and declined the position. Let someone else take the spotlight this time. As winter crept in and the last of the leaves turned brittle and gold, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Not perfect, not utopian, but grounded.
Real.
The kind of place where people looked each other in the eye. Where rules didn't come from a clipboard, but from a shared sense of decency. The porch remained exactly as it had been since the day I moved in. Only now, it belonged to me in every way that mattered.